Last hour of trade on Wall Street. It is Wednesday, September the 19th. Here's what's driving the day. Stock markets shrugging off the trade wars. They could close at record highs this hour. Tech shares are lagging, though, as the EU looks into Amazon's data use. And yet there's nothing but green in the cannabis sector. Weed stocks just can't stop growing. I'm Stephanie Tsai. This is Quest Means Business. Tonight, the EU opens up a new front in its war with the U.S. tech giants. After dealing major blows to both Apple and Google, EU Competition Commissioner Margaret Vestager is now adding Amazon to her antitrust hit list. Shares in Amazon are falling at this hour, down 26 points. Brussels says it's investigating whether the company uses data from smaller third-party sellers to gain an edge over its competitors. In a press conference earlier, Vestager explained the case against Amazon.
The question here is about the data, because if you, as Amazon, get the data from the smaller merchants that you host, which can be, of course, completely legitimate because you can improve your service to these smaller merchants, well, do you then also use these data to do your own calculations as what is the new big thing? What is it that people want? What kind of offers do they like to receive? What makes them buy things?
This is just the latest example of the European Union's crusade to rein in Amazon and its Silicon Valley rivals. Last year, Amazon was ordered to pay almost $300 million in unpaid taxes after the EU Commission found it benefited from an illegal arrangement with Luxembourg. In July, Google was hit with a record $5 billion fine for breaking antitrust laws with its Android operating system. Facebook was fined $122 million for misleading European officials about its takeover of messaging service WhatsApp. And just this week, Apple ponied up $14 billion in unpaid taxes to Ireland after the EU complained. Scott Galloway is a professor of marketing at NYU Stern and author of The Four, which is about these big tech companies. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with this new probe into Amazon. How significant is the investigation, and what does it portend?
So it's another point in a line that is essentially showing that the war against big tech will break out where all the major conflicts of the 20th century broke out, and that is it's going to break out in continental Europe. There's more action in any given quarter in the last 2 years against big tech in Europe than there is in the U.S. So this is just another data point showing that, quite frankly, the EU is fed up with American big tech.
The World War II analogy is interesting.
Too much? Too much?
Maybe a little hyperbolic, but today Amazon did become the third largest digital advertiser. I mean, still way behind Facebook and Google, and yet that targeted advertising is largely dependent on data. So how much of a threat to its advertising business is a potential probe into where it gets its data?
Well, so you bring up a great point. So Amazon, Morgan Stanley predicted that Amazon would do $4.5 billion in advertising this year. Our analysis shows they're going to do over $11 billion. Or put another way, Amazon might do as much in advertising this year as Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram combined. This is Amazon. Amazon in 2 years may be one of the 5 largest media companies in the world. And this is what happens when you have an invasive species that, unlike any other company in history, can grow to become the most valuable company in the world, which it will be in the next 60 days, without ever having to achieve meaningful profitability, meaning they can reinvest 100 cents on the dollar back in any business. It is almost impossible to compete with Amazon. I personally don't believe these fines. I think they're a gnat on the windshield of a tractor-trailer truck. When Google got fined $5 billion, that day it was announced the stock went up.
That is the question, how to deal with the outsized power of these tech companies. Now, you bring up the fact that they're becoming a media company, and of course, we had AT&T Time Warner merger, which included CNN, and part of what the judge said in his ruling was looking at the outsized power of these companies in the digital advertising space. So you see that response, but is regulation the right strategy? Are fines the right strategy? Is any of that going to make a difference when you consider how large the market capitalization of these 4 or 5 companies are?
So when you have a company like Google with $100 billion in cash and you're fined at $5 billion, what you're effectively telling Google to do is to continue to break the law. If you had a parking meter in front of your house that costs $100 an hour, but the ticket was 25 cents, you would continue to break the law. And that's what we've been telling these companies to do, with fines that might sound large in dollar terms, but in terms of impact, aren't that large. You ask what we should do. I believe regulation has unintended consequences. I think GDPR has actually emboldened and strengthened these companies' position. I believe that the future to oxygenate the marketplace is to break these guys up. I think antitrust action is the way to go.
Do you think that there is a real risk of that now? I know that the U.S. Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, is having a meeting with states' attorneys generals next week to discuss this very topic. We're starting to hear that word antitrust. We're even starting to hear the word monopoly associated with some of these companies. Is that a growing regulatory risk for these mega tech companies? Could you actually see them getting broken up?
I used to think there was no way, because Amazon has 88 full-time lobbyists in D.C. We in the U.S., I would say, suffer a little bit from what I'd call this gross idolatry of innovators and billionaires. We see them as our heroes. But I do think there is a movement afoot. Now, whether it happens out of D.C., I would say most likely no. I think the pushback is going to come out of Brussels and possibly a red state, where an attorney general in that state sees that the brightest blue line path to the governor's mansion is to make an argument against these tech companies that, quite frankly, probably haven't been good. Have they been good for California? Yes. New York? Yes. Has it been good for Kansas? What's happened to the ad agencies, the retailers, the businesses in those states? I think a lot of these red states have decided, you know what, big tech, we've been net losers here. So I don't think it's going to come out of D.C. It might. The DOJ should absolutely do its job. The call to restrain the acquisition of this company was ridiculous in comparison to the power of these other companies. So I actually do believe there is a non-zero probability now that the DOJ or the FTC or a state AG might go after these companies and accuse them of anti-competitive behavior and propose antitrust and breaking up as a solution. It's
an interesting paradox, because you have Amazon yet to announce the second location for its headquarters, and you have, local mayors and governors courting Amazon. At the same time, you see it coming under increasing potential antitrust scrutiny and other bad headlines following it as well. Do you see public opinion changing at all toward the power of these big tech companies, while at the same time we're also dependent on them?
Oh, the worm has absolutely turned. 2 years ago, the only argument was who was more Christ-like or going to be the next president among their CEOs. Really, the weaponization of the Facebook platform by the GRU of the Russian government changed everything. And now citizens are starting to feel a lot more wary about these firms. But you brought up an interesting point. The competition to be the host of the next HQ and regulation are linked, Stephanie, because the next headquarters for Amazon will be Washington, D.C., the metro area. And the reason why, and it was always going to be D.C., is one, the Bezos have a home there, and a CEO always gets to pick where the company's second headquarters are going to be. And two, the only thing standing in between Amazon's valuation of $1 trillion and $2 trillion is regulation. And no one is going to regulate the individual that throws out the first pitch at the 2019 opening game of the Washington Nationals, which will be Jeff Bezos. This competition was a ruse to transfer wealth from fire departments and school departments to the shareholders of Amazon. It was always going to be D.C. This has been a terrible abuse of the Commonwealth.
And how many lobbyists does Amazon have in D.C. right now?
Last check, 88 full-time lobbyists in D.C.
Scott Galloway. We're going to have to see if you're right on that.
We'll see, right? It's going to be embarrassing if they announce they pick Indianapolis this afternoon.
Well, D.C. could certainly use the jobs. Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's turn to Europe and the massive money laundering case that's shaking the financial world. The CEO of Danske Bank is out. A new report from the firm details its employees' failure to conduct basic due diligence on customers and managers' failure to heed warning signs. The tentacles of the investigation and the alleged wrongdoing are spreading. Regulators in the United States, Denmark, and Estonia are all probing Danske Bank's operations. And the probes center on the bank's tiny subsidiary in Estonia. Lax controls there allowed through more than $230 billion. They came from thousands of suspicious customers outside Estonia, and that dollar amount is nearly twice what was previously reported. The bank is alleged to have become a conduit for money coming from Russia and former Soviet states. The allegations are linked with fraud cases exposed by Bill Browder and his former lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered in a Russian prison. Bill Browder himself was kicked out of Russia. He has since filed several criminal complaints over Danske Bank's behavior. Bill is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and author of Red Notice, which is all about his experience in Russia. And he joins me now from London. Bill, it's great to have you with us with all these developments happening. First of all, describe for our viewers, if you will, what your interest is in this investigation and why you have filed or are planning to file a criminal complaint against Danske Bank in Denmark. What are you accusing the bank of?
Well, so it all comes back to the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer who worked for me in Russia. He uncovered a $230 million government corruption scheme. He exposed it, and in retaliation, he was arrested, tortured, and killed 8.5 years ago at the age of 37, leaving a wife and 2 children. I've been on a mission to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky, which has led me to look for who got the benefit of the $230 million crime that he exposed and was killed over. We've been investigating it, my team and I, for the last 8.5 years, and we've discovered that a lot of that money flowed to Danske Bank's Estonian branch. And my interest in this whole story is that I don't want anybody who was involved in the laundering of the funds that killed Sergei Magnitsky to get away with it. And so I and my team have filed criminal complaints in Denmark, in Estonia, which has led to the opening of a criminal case. And the criminal cases, or the criminal complaints that we filed, has metastasized into this big discovery. And now we're effectively facing the largest money laundering scandal in the history of Europe through Danske Bank.
So it is still a question exactly how much of those funds that went through Estonia were considered suspicious transactions. And I know that you have said it is $8.3 billion. Bill, what proof do you have of that? And do you have evidence tying that back to specific individuals and entities in Russia that you've been looking at related to the death of Mr. Magnitsky?
Yeah, so in addition to the criminal complaints that we filed in Estonia and Denmark, we filed criminal complaints in about 26 countries, and there are now 15 live money laundering investigations connected to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and the money laundering of that case. And from those criminal investigations, and particularly one in France, we've been able to get documents from a subset, not the whole account, but a subset of the Danske Bank transactions. And from that subset, we've determined that $8.8 billion of suspicious transactions went through Danske Bank. And it went through Danske Bank on its way to other countries, including the United Kingdom, where I am right now, France, Germany, Spain, and other places. And as a result of those transfers, there are cases open in those countries looking into the purchases of houses, of chartering of yachts, private planes, etc.
What else do you want to know with regards to Danske's Estonia branch's role in all of this? And do you believe that this was just a lack of due diligence and understanding who their clients were and where the money was coming from? Or are you alleging further malfeasance?
Well, and the report that came out today from Danske Bank itself, from its own internal lawyers, showed that in 2007, Danske Bank was warned by the Russian central bank that money going through this Estonian subsidiary was from the proceeds of crime. And so with this the whole problem started in 2007, or at least the bank became aware in 2007, but they carried on for 8 years. And according to these numbers, $234 billion flowed through the bank after they were made aware that this was bad money coming from Russia. So this was not just a failure to do due diligence. There were a lot of people profiting from this, and those people didn't want the flows to stop.
So the CEO, Thomas Borgen, has resigned. Bill, what else do you think should happen from here?
Well, we've asked the Estonian and the Danish prosecutors to investigate the CEO, the people around him, and the employees that were responsible for these transfers to see what their criminal liability is. I don't know what he knew or what he didn't know, but that's for the law enforcement agencies to determine.
Bill Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining us with your insights on this case. We'll continue to follow the developments, of course. Later in the program, we're going to be talking about another corruption scandal, the 1MDB saga in Malaysia. I'll speak to the authors of a new book about the investor they're calling a modern Gatsby. Stocks are surging and investors have reefer madness. We'll explain why one marijuana company's shares are up 50%.